Around 40,000 years ago, in a cave overlooking the sea at the southern tip of Spain, the last Neanderthals on Earth were dying out. Not in a single dramatic battle, not in one bad winter. Slowly, quietly, generation by generation, until one day there simply weren't any more of them left. Meanwhile, not far away, a different kind of human was thriving, spreading across the same continent, building bigger camps, having more children who survived to adulthood. For decades, the story we told ourselves was simple and frankly a little smug. Neanderthals were slow, brutish, less intelligent, and we, the clever ones, simply outthought them into extinction. It's a satisfying story. It's also, according to the actual evidence, mostly wrong. The real answer is stranger, messier, and involves at least 5 separate suspects: a supervolcano, a brain built differently from ours, a population so small it was already living on borrowed time, and a twist ending that means the Neanderthals never actually fully disappeared at all. Some of them are still here, possibly in you. Let's start by clearing something up, because the old story about Neanderthal stupidity has been thoroughly overturned by recent discoveries. In 2018, researchers dated cave paintings in Spain, geometric patterns and hand stencils, to at least 64,000 years ago. That's over 20,000 years before modern humans are known to have arrived in Europe. The only humans who could have painted them were Neanderthals. We've also found Neanderthal jewelry, pierced in pigmented shells, eagle talons deliberately modified and strung together. We found evidence of controlled fire, complex hunting strategies for taking down massive, dangerous animals, and burial practices that suggest some form of ritual or emotional significance around death. These were not lesser humans stumbling through existence. They were a separate, successful human species that had survived in Ice Age Europe for over 300,000 years, far longer than modern humans have existed at all. So if stupidity isn't the answer, what actually happened? Here's the first genuinely strange piece of the puzzle. Neanderthal brains, on average, were not smaller than ours. Fossil skull measurements consistently show Neanderthal cranial capacity slightly larger than the modern human average, often in the range of 1,500 to 1,600 cubic centimeters, compared to roughly 1,350 for us. So why didn't a bigger brain save them? Because size alone isn't the whole story. Detailed reconstructions of Neanderthal skull shape suggest their brains devoted proportionally more space to processing vision and controlling the body, likely an adaptation to low light levels at higher latitudes, and comparatively less space to the regions modern human brains use heavily for complex social processing and long-range planning. That difference matters more than it might sound. Later in this video, we're going to see direct evidence that Neanderthal social groups were smaller and less interconnected than modern human groups at the same moment in history. A brain built to prioritize different things may be part of why. The first clue about their vulnerability comes from something we didn't have access to until relatively recently: their actual DNA. In 2014, researchers sequenced a high-quality Neanderthal genome from a toe bone found in a Siberian cave. The genetic diversity was remarkably low, and the pattern was even more specific than that. That particular individual's genome showed long, unbroken stretches of identical DNA inherited from both parents, the unmistakable genetic signature of a close inbred relationship, potentially a half-sibling pairing, or something similarly close. This wasn't a one-off. It matched a broader pattern consistent with small, isolated groups that had been interbreeding among close relatives for generations. Some estimates put the total Neanderthal population across all of Europe and Asia, at any given point, somewhere in the range of just a few thousand to a few tens of thousands of individuals, spread across an enormous territory. Compare that to a healthy, growing population, and the difference matters enormously. Small, fragmented populations are far more vulnerable to random bad luck, a disease outbreak, a few bad hunting seasons, a harsh winter, because there simply aren't enough individuals or enough genetic variation to absorb the shock and recover. Neanderthals may have already been walking a tightrope long before modern humans ever entered the picture. Here's where it gets almost unfairly dramatic. Around 39,000 years ago, right in the middle of the window when Neanderthal populations were collapsing. A massive volcanic eruption tore through what is now Italy. Geologists call it the Campanian ignimbrite eruption, and it was one of the largest volcanic events in Europe in the last 200,000 years. It threw an enormous volume of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, likely triggering a period of significant cooling, and disrupted vegetation across a huge swath of Europe and Western Asia, precisely the region where the last Neanderthal populations were clinging on. This eruption also overlapped with a naturally occurring cold snap in the broader climate cycle of the period, compounding the disruption even further. For a large, resilient, well-connected population, an event like this would be a serious challenge. For a population already small, fragmented, and short on genetic diversity, it may have been closer to a final push over the edge. At almost exactly the same time, something else was happening. Modern humans were arriving in Europe in growing numbers, and they weren't just another group competing for the same land. They came with some meaningful advantages. Evidence suggests early modern human groups maintained larger social networks spanning greater distances, trading materials, information, and likely mates across dozens or even hundreds of kilometers. Neanderthal groups, by comparison, appear to have been more socially isolated, with less evidence of this kind of long-distance exchange network, a pattern that lines up with what we just saw in their brain structure. That difference matters enormously in a crisis. A wider network means access to more resources, more mates to prevent inbreeding, and faster spread of useful knowledge and technology. Exactly the kind of buffer that helps a population survive a shock like a volcanic winter. Modern humans also appear to have used more efficient projectile weapons for hunting at a distance, compared to the heavier thrusting spears more commonly associated with Neanderthal hunting technology, which may have made modern human groups more efficient competitors for the same shrinking pool of large game. None of this means modern humans were simply smarter. It means they had, whether through circumstance or adaptation, a set of tools, a population structure, and a social strategy that happened to be better suited to surviving exactly the kind of environmental chaos that was unfolding at that moment. Here's where the story stops being simple. In 2010, the first full Neanderthal genome was published, and it revealed something nobody expected. Neanderthals and modern humans had interbred. If you have ancestry outside of sub-Saharan Africa, you almost certainly carry Neanderthal DNA right now, typically somewhere between 1 and 2% of your total genome. Multiply that across billions of people alive today, and the total surviving Neanderthal genetic material may actually exceed what existed in Neanderthal populations at their peak. So, in a very real sense, Neanderthals were not simply replaced. They were, at least partially, absorbed. And it turns out this contact wasn't even a single event. In 2016, researchers found something remarkable hiding inside that same Siberian Neanderthal genome. Fragments of modern human DNA dating to roughly 100,000 years ago, tens of thousands of years before the main wave of interbreeding most people think of. That means an earlier group of modern humans had already made contact with Neanderthals and interbred with them long before the population that eventually replaced them across Europe ever arrived. The two lineages weren't strangers meeting once at the very end. They crossed paths repeatedly, in different places, at different times, over tens of thousands of years. But the story has one more twist, and it's a genuinely strange one. When researchers mapped exactly where Neanderthal DNA shows up in modern genomes, they found something unusual. Certain regions are almost completely empty of Neanderthal ancestry, especially on the X chromosome, and in genes active in testes tissue. This is the genetic signature of reduced hybrid fertility, a pattern seen across many species when two closely related but distinct lineages interbreed. It suggests that male hybrid offspring in particular may have faced reduced fertility, and that natural selection gradually filtered out Neanderthal genetic material from these specific regions over thousands of generations. In other words, the two populations weren't merging cleanly into one. Biology itself was pushing back against full integration, even while interbreeding was actively happening, repeatedly, across tens of thousands of years. It's a genuinely rare, precise snapshot of two human species in the exact narrow window of being similar enough to interbreed, but different enough that the biology hadn't fully caught up. So what actually killed off the Neanderthals? Not stupidity, not a single war, a single winter, or a single decisive advantage. The honest answer is that it was almost certainly 5 things at once. A brain wired for a different set of priorities, a population already stretched thin and genetically fragile, a catastrophic volcanic eruption at the worst possible moment, a competing human population with wider social networks and more efficient tools, and a slow, repeated generational process of interbreeding that pulled apart the very idea of 2 separate species. It wasn't a single killing blow. It was a perfect storm, arriving all at once against a population that simply didn't have enough resilience left to absorb it. And maybe that's the part of this story that deserves to replace the old myth. Neanderthals didn't lose because they were lesser. They ran out of room to absorb bad luck. At the exact moment the world handed them an unusually large amount of it. Again and again, over tens of thousands of years. We survived that same period not because we were smarter, but because this time the dice landed in our favor. And in the most literal sense possible, they never fully left. Their genes are still here, quietly running in the background of a species that outlasted them. Somewhere in your own DNA, right now, there's a small, stubborn